The Family Guy universe has always had an odd relationship with death. Sometimes it sticks, sometimes it doesn't, and since the characters are really hard to kill, it's usually kind of a non-factor, but when death is looming, there's Doug, more commonly known as the Grim Reaper or just Death. And in this video, we're going to take a deep dive into Death's history in the Family Guy universe. But hey, real quick guys, I'm trying to reach 1,500 subscribers, and if you guys could help me out with that, it would be greatly appreciated. I'm also trying to hit 3,000 watch hours, so if you guys could just leave this video playing in the background and, you know, just kind of let it run through, it would be really helpful for me. But let's go ahead and get into that. So we really don't know how Death was brought into existence or really anything about their early childhood. We do know that they have a mom and that they had a dad, so it is implied that they were kind of just born the old-fashioned way, but we don't really know. We do know that Death went to school all the way up to their senior year and went to prom with their cousin, probably because Death was still in the closet as trans and was struggling to connect with others at this point in their life, especially since, due to their own inner turmoil, their Reaper powers would actually manifest slightly out of control, killing any woman or man that touched their bones. This leads Death to actually killing the girl that they were losing their virginity to, even though once she died, they just went ahead and did her corpse. This also led to them getting picked on and laughed at a lot because they were like so awkward. So gross. Just gross, wrong, and illegal on so many different levels. Even if Death is technically dead, just no. But at least this is just one time this is going to happen in the show. Right? This ultimately culminated with Death graduating from high school and finally coming out to their parents, telling them they wanting to be a wood nymph. Unfortunately, this would not go well, with Death's dad getting angry, saying he has no son, and his mom just standing there pretty much saying nothing. The end result of this was that Death never really got to be themselves, since Death clearly went on to be the Grim Reaper, collecting the souls for the afterlife. Luckily, this doesn't seem to have ultimately ended the relationship with their parents though, since they still live with their mom, who still babies them and treats them like a little kid, and states that they wish dad were still dead later on in life, implying that they had at least had a good relationship. However, Death would get to explore their sexuality while they were away at college, starring in several adult films, learning some, let's just say, tricks of the trade, but ultimately not being too proud of the films. But Death would ultimately go on to graduate and go on to be one of the main Reapers for the mortals of the universe. Now, it is important to note here that there are multiple Reapers in the universe who perform different functions. For instance, there's Death's dog, who handles animal reapings, and Super Death, who reaps Reapers when they die. Now, we don't really know much of what Death does after becoming a Reaper. We do know that they join the hippie movement in the 60s, actually sticking with it through the 70s and into the 80s. And a couple of things happen in 1984 that will sort of tie Death in to the Griffin family themselves. Because the one reaping we see them do is actually a man that was involved in a truck crash that was caused by Peter and Lois. This act is actually watched by future Death in a flashback while Peter is having a near-death experience, and they also see Carter knock out Peter before his and Lois's first date, drop Peter off in the ocean where he is saved by Quagmire. Death's mom would actually show up, upset that they didn't tell her that they were going back in time. They watch as Quagmire and Peter become friends, Peter missing Lois and Quagmire dropping him off on shore in order to get back to her. They see Peter meet Cleveland running from the KKK and ultimately getting back into Lois's house and turning down $1 million from Carter to leave Lois for good, and Peter ultimately turning him down, saying Lois is the one he wants to marry. Also at this point, Death from farther in the future brings Peter and Brian back to the past for Peter to relive the glory days. Peter makes out with Molly Ringwald, saying they would be back later on in her career. They actually end up re-looping this day a few times, since Peter keeps messing things up, until Death finally gets mad and says no more mulligans, forcing Peter to fix things on his own. This ultimately results in at least one future timeline we get to see, but we will kind of go over that when we get there. It is technically a non-canon timeline. And all of this sort of cosmically ties the Griffins to Death, like I said before, since realistically, they were sort of the one that made it possible for Lois and Peter to get together. And as we are going to see going forward, this will specifically apply to Peter himself, with Death actually becoming more of a conscience-like figure for him in their future. Death might also have the responsibility to act as a judge for hell, since Bart Simpson tells a story on Halloween in 1993 where a devil, Ned Flanders, sues Homer for his soul, and the Grim Reaper or Death acts as the judge for the case. Also, this is where we find out that their name is Doug, but this could also just be Bart exaggerating, so we don't actually know for sure if their name actually is Doug. But Death reaped Flojo in 1998, though it is implied that in this universe they had to actually chase her down in order to do the reaping instead of her dying in her sleep from a seizure like in the real world. But ultimately, in 2000, Death would return to Quahog, Rhode Island. When Peter lies and says that he was deceased to get out of paying a doctor's bill, the hospital sent this to Death, and they show up at the Griffin's house. They end up being invited to dinner by Stewie, who is a huge fan. While at the dinner, Death puts a whole chicken leg in their mouth and sucks the chicken off of it, prompting Meg to go, "Ew, how did you do that?" and Death saying he did some videos he wasn't proud of, wanting to end the awkward moment. They then tell Peter it's time to go, and they start to leave the house. Peter would take the opportunity to run, but Death chases after him, mentioning that they caught Flojo, but just before they catch Peter, Death twists their ankle. The Griffins are nice enough not to leave them out, and Peter brings them back into the house. There, the family makes them comfortable, and Death decides they are going to stay with them for a few days while their ankle heals. While there, Lois tries to convince them not to kill Peter, but Death is honestly pretty rude. The best way I can describe it is a lot of sassy, snide comments. Lois does eventually convince Death to spare Peter's life, but Death says that they owe them one. Lois starts to unburn her shirt, but Death says no, they just wanted another fruit cup. Unfortunately, while this was happening, Peter lets the entire world know that Death is out of the picture, and when Death finds out, he gets angry, saying, "Oh god, this is high school over again," with them laughing at him, and they would show them. Trying to stand up, their ankle is still sprung, so Lois will not let them go. So Death makes Peter into the new Grim Reaper, in order to show the world that Death is back. Death then chooses for Peter to kill the kids from Dawson Creek. Peter doesn't want to and says he won't do it, but then Death tells him, "You kill them or I will kill you." So Peter goes to kill them. Calling Death from the plane, they would explain that Peter doesn't actually have to do anything but sit there. The plane would crash due to a pilot error with no survivors. Peter realizes he can't do it, tells Death that he doesn't care if Death does kill him, and tries to stop the plane crash from happening, but ends up killing the pilots by touching them, and Karen Black lands the plane. The plane didn't actually fail since the pilots did die, and this made the news. Death was still upset, but does let Peter live. His ankle healed, he just leaves the house, saying that they would be back really soon. So a couple of takeaways here. One, Death was totally faking the sprained ankle. I mean, they're just a skeleton, so maybe they wanted some time off for this. It is the first example of Death acting as Peter's conscience and teaching him the lesson that he needed to know throughout the episode. Also, we see their powers are pretty passive. All they have to do is be in the presence of where death is about to occur, and they will know when and how it's going to happen. Soon after this, we see Death collecting souls from a frat house where two men drank themselves to death while looking for a golden scroll to get into a beer factory. Death would pull back their hood, revealing their skull, pop the can off a beer with their eye socket, then down the beer. They would drink quite a bit, trying to find the scroll to win the tour of the Pawtucket Brewery. Then, making the decision to drive before sobering up. Remember kids, don't drink and drive. They would then hop into their car, eat some gum, then pull out directly into a police officer, most likely getting arrested. A year later, when Peter skips his anniversary with Lois to go golfing and ends up getting struck by lightning, Death would show up to reap Peter's soul. Recognizing each other, they point and say, "You again." Death once again acts as a conscience to Peter, teaching him a lesson by helping Peter rediscover his love for Lois through a near-death experience. Death tells Peter he isn't dying, but is upset that they have to hang out with Peter, who asks when he is going to die. Death answers about 2 years after his wife divorces him. Peter says Lois wouldn't do that she has been crazy about him since the day they met, triggering the flashback where we see them get together and Death with his afro reaping the truck driver. Thinking he proved his point, Peter tries to leave, and Death, really not wanting to deal with him, says fine, if you don't want to follow the rules, stay in limbo, and leaves. Peter follows them all the way to their mom's house where they were going to have dinner. Death's mom is upset that they're late and starts giving them a hard time, so Death says they have to take a leak. This is where we see the flashbacks I went over earlier, and Death actually starts to doubt themselves, saying, "If I can't even get a date, how am I supposed to help you fix your marriage?" So Peter makes a deal with Death to help them get a date in exchange for putting them back in his body, which Peter does, helping them get a date with this girl named Amy, and asking Death for one more favor. They would go to Peter Frampton's house, the singer of the song that was playing the first night Peter and Lois got together, to go and help Peter surprises Lois for their anniversary, and essentially Death saves their marriage. After this, Death goes on the date with Amy, but since she keeps going on about animal rights, Death just touches her and kills her. Kind of their answer to everything. They just lose interest and they just kill whoever they're even attempting to be attracted to. Probably because they're just still trying to be in the closet, I think, and clearly women are not their strong suit, but who knows. That same year, Death has to go back to the Griffin's house with his dog to claim Brian Griffin when he choked on a biscuit, but Peter actually ended up giving Brian the Heimlich, saving Brian, but the biscuit shot into Mr. Weed's throat, Peter's boss, and he dies instead. So Death just takes Mr. Weed's soul instead. So like I said, he's not very picky. As long as there's a dead body, he'll just take that dead body. But 2 years later, the story of Peter becoming the Grim Reaper and Death not taking place has actually become an urban legend, to the point where Bart once again tells the story in Tree's House of Horror, except replacing Peter with Homer. Basically, Death shows up to reap Homer, and then he becomes the Grim Reaper. After this, in 2005, when Peter finds out he is mentally handicapped, Death is actually dancing during the song they sing in the episode all about Peter being mentally handicapped. And okay, clearly the show uses the other word, but if you don't catch my meaning, the song's probably still on YouTube. The episode is season 4, episode 6. Go look it up. They things they could get away with, you know? Not a bad song, but meh, couldn't happen today. Shortly after this, they would show up on Peter's fishing boat and ask for a beer. The guys asked them why they're there, and Death would simply point at a big wave and say for that. Now, the weird thing here is no one actually dies, so why did Death appear? And I think it is actually to warn Peter, since we know Peter can't die till his and Lois's divorce, so Death has to make sure that doesn't happen. And Peter's friends might have just gotten lucky being next to Peter, so they don't actually die either. The next year, they come to Quagmire's funeral, since the guys have faked his death in order to get him out of his marriage to a girl named Joan, who actually jumps in front of Death to protect Quagmire, but makes the mistake of touching Death, which actually ends up killing her. Since Death wasn't going to leave without a body, probably getting tired of not actually getting Peter's friends, Peter tells them that her last name was Quagmire and she was suicidal. Death is cool with it and goes to take Joan, but Quagmire has to wait 5 minutes. Again, no. Twice in one video, I have had to cover that weird thing in this topic, and it is not in the only time in the series that Quagmire actually sleeps with a dead person. I mean, what the The next year, Death shows up with the drunken clam to see if Horace is still alive when he falls. He isn't dead, and we find out they like to spend their free time near Mike Wallace, but this is where Peter asks him to take him back in time for one last hurrah. Initially, Death isn't going to do it, but then the TV says coming up next on ESPN, Women's Professional, and before it can finish, Death says, "You win, but just for the night." They then leap Peter back in time, like we already touched upon, except when they come back, Peter has changed the past, so they are now in an alternate future where Lois is married to Quagmire and Peter is married to Molly Ringwald. Peter and Brian need Death to fix it, although the world actually seems to be a much better place if Lois and Peter don't get married, and they show up when Jane Jetson falls from the spaceship, saying they have had a busy day, saying Dick Cheney, the chairman of Halliburton, shot Supreme Court Justice Scalia in a hunting accident, and the bullet went right through and killed Karl Rove and Tucker Carlson, prompting Brian to say, "Peter, you can't marry Lois," but Peter of course doesn't know who any of those people are. Thus, Death takes them back again, like we already touched upon, until Peter finally fixes the past and erases this particular little jaunt from history. It's just fun for me to acknowledge. And we actually don't see them again for about 4 years until they show up when Peter has a drunk car crash after heavily drinking at an AA meeting. But again, instead of killing Peter, they would act as Peter's conscience, showing Peter two possible futures, one where he is an abusive alcoholic, and the other where he is the complete opposite and a complete bore. All to get through to Peter's head that it is okay to drink, you just have to do it in moderation. And like I said before, don't drink and drive. Again, twice in one video. But also, this lesson clearly didn't stick with Peter, so great effort on the episode, but the premise is relatively lost quickly on Peter. And maybe Death actually realizes this, because he kinda doesn't come back to help Peter out as like a conscience figure after this. So Peter might very well have just kind of burned that bridge. Same year though, Death actually dies in a traffic accident, where Super Death then shows up and tells them that when a Reaper dies, they are actually reincarnated, which happens immediately. However, since they are reincarnated as a girl in China, they are immediately killed, and then turned back into a Grim Reaper, with Super Death saying girl and Death confirming girl. Seriously, how did some of these things make it on television? Also, please go watch my last video where I use this to kind of confirm Death's sexuality. If you're wondering why I've been using they them pronouns in this whole video, and I kind of touched on it in the beginning, but that was like the dedicated video to it. But then 3 years later, for their last major appearance, Death shows up at the Clam for the Cleveland show. Basically, the show literally died. The gang asks them if they could take them to see God, and Death says of course they can, but don't you mean her. The guy's eyes widen, but then they start laughing, saying of course they're a dude and let's go. Peter thanks them again and they say it's no problem and that they were supposed to kill Russell Brand, but they will just do this instead. Peter tries to say that they can wait, but Death just leaps them to heaven. Turns out looks just like a sandals resort, but then God shows up and Death just leaves. Later on, he returns to bring the guys back, and when Peter grabs God for a hug, God freaks out and Death tells them that God is actually autistic. And that is the last appearance we get from Death in Family Guy, but it's not quite the end of the story because we can jump 1,000 years into the future with Futurama. And possibly because people are living to crazy ages, or just because advancements in medical and cloning technology, people are living extremely long lives, as well as the fact that it was discovered that, like in the Matrix, you can actually use people as batteries. Because of this, Death either just retired or possibly created the Sunset Squad robot that work at the near Death Star, the virtual retirement community for the elderly. These robots are designed like Grim Reapers and actually come to take the elderly people away or reap them when they turn 160 years old, like we see when they take away Professor Farnsworth to the near Death Star after he had been lying about his age. Here they will continue to live as batteries in a virtual retirement home while providing power to parts of the universe, and we see very few people die of old age in Futurama, so it would make more sense to bring the people who are near death to the place as opposed to chasing them across the universe, because the human race kind of spread across the universe. It's also kind of possible in some odd way, shape, or form that Death did actually finally die, because a lot of facsimiles of like things are kind of replaced with robots in the Futurama universe. But I think it's more fun to think that they're actually just still out there and that they just own the near Death Star. But these new Reapers are still robots and are apparently based on Earth, since we see them at the party for robots that are about to be destroyed to save the planet, until Professor Farnsworth figures out how to use the robots to save the planet. Essentially, by turning on their exhaust burners, they can push Earth farther away from the sun, thus ending global warming. Crazy thing robots can do in this planet. But that is, at least as of recording this video, the complete story of Death in the Family Guy universe. And for a character we have not heard from for at least 11 years, we got a lot more of their life story than I actually expected. But let me know what you think. Did I leave anything out? Did you enjoy the timeline, or was this a waste of my time? Let me know in the comments down below, and stick around for a few honorable mentions that just didn't quite make it into the video. And while you guys are down dropping those comments, please remember to hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and turn on that notification bell. Alright, so the honorable mentions here, if you guys wanted to click off, it's actually in Tree Out the Vor 7, Death appears for a couch gag using the dead Simpsons as a footrest. In the American Dad episode, Deacon Stan Jesus Man, season 1, which is in season 1, episode 7, Death is represented by Carl Rove. Couldn't really figure out how to like bring him into it at all. Family Guy viewer mail number 1, which has some non-canon material and then some canon material. We actually see like a younger version of Death who says, doesn't he have enough trouble fitting in? And I didn't include that because it just didn't make sense for the rest of the timeline. In season 11, episode 17, Big Fat, Death reaps a mailman killed by Stewie in an extended opening / dream sequence where they did Family Guy as King of the Hill. And then in Futurama, the Death robots cameo in The Wild Green Yonder. I just couldn't find the clip, and so they're just kind of there. So like I said, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please tune in for the next one.